The Wilkerson estate stretched across acres of perfectly trimmed lawns and glittering fountains. Tall iron gates guarded the property like loyal sentinels, keeping the outside world far away. The driveway was lined with imported roses, each bloom tended by gardeners who worked from dawn until dusk. Inside, everything gleamed, marble floors polished until they reflected faces, velvet curtains heavy enough to block out the California sun, chandeliers dripping with crystals that sparkled like frozen rain. It wasn't a home, it was a palace. At the top of this empire was Robert Wilkerson, a billionaire who built his fortune in oil and real estate. Silver streaked his hair now, but his posture was still straight, his gaze still sharp. He had fought through boardrooms and corporate wars to build his empire from nothing, and he wore his success like armor. But his greatest failure lived under his own roof. Ethan Wilkerson, his only son, had never known hunger, fear, or sacrifice. With his perfectly styled blonde hair, designer sneakers, and the smug smirk that rarely left his face, Ethan was every bit the poster child for privilege. His social media was filled with parties, cars, and careless grins, but never achievements, never milestones, never growth. Robert had provided everything: tutors, coaches, even personal mentors. Yet Ethan failed exams, walked out on interviews, and mocked anyone who tried to teach him discipline. To Robert, it wasn't just a disappointment. It was a wound. The mansion sparkled, but behind those walls, the future of the Wilkerson name was crumbling. It was on a warm morning that a black sedan rolled slowly up the estate's back entrance. Out stepped Grace Johnson, a 45-year-old black woman whose presence contrasted sharply with the glittering luxury around her. Grace carried herself with quiet dignity, though her clothes were plain and her hands calloused from years of labor. Her life hadn't been carved in marble or polished by wealth. It had been built on sweat, sacrifice, and scars. She had raised 2 children on her own in Atlanta, scrubbing floors and working double shifts so they would never go hungry. Life had been cruel, but it had also made her strong. Grace wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy. She didn't need to be. Her strength radiated in silence, in the way she walked with purpose, in the way her eyes held both kindness and steel. Now, she was starting a new job as a maid in the Wilkerson mansion. To her, it was work, steady pay, a roof, and dignity in labor. But she had no idea that stepping through those doors would pull her into a battle much larger than dusting shelves and folding linens. Her very presence unsettled Ethan the moment he laid eyes on her. To him, she wasn't just a maid. She was a reminder of everything he believed himself to be above. The tilt of his chin, the mocking glance, the sneer when she passed, all of it carried the same venom, racism disguised as arrogance. Grace noticed it. She always noticed. But she had faced worse than a spoiled boy with too much money and too little heart. By the end of her first week, Grace had seen enough. Ethan slept until noon, tossed dirty clothes on the floor, shouted at staff for the smallest mistakes, and laughed at their accents. He mocked the gardener's broken English. He sneered at the chef for his cheap meals. And when he looked at Grace, his insults were sharper, colder, soaked in racism. "Isn't it funny," he once smirked while tossing a shirt at her feet, "how the world never changes? People like me give orders. People like you pick up after us, but Grace didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she bent down, picked up the shirt, and continued with her work. Her silence wasn't submission, it was power. It was the refusal to let him drag her into the mud of his ignorance. That silence unnerved Ethan more than if she had yelled. He had driven tutors to tears, reduced staff to quitting. But Grace, she simply carried on, her eyes calm, her spirit unbroken. For the first time in his life, Ethan had met someone who couldn't be rattled by wealth or cruelty. And that scared him. Late one night, Robert Wilkerson sat in his vast office, surrounded by towering shelves of law books and oil contracts. Papers littered his mahogany desk. His empire was thriving, but his heart was heavy. He looked at the framed photo of Ethan as a child, laughing, carefree, full of potential. Somewhere along the way, that potential had soured into entitlement. Robert had spent millions trying to educate his son. Tutors, mentors, elite academies. But Ethan failed them all. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because he lacked humility. And humility, Robert knew, couldn't be bought. That night, he saw Grace walking past his office door with a basket of laundry balanced on her hip. Something about her caught his attention. Not just her posture, but the quiet resilience in her steps. She moved like a woman who had carried heavier burdens than baskets of clothes. A thought struck him. Perhaps tutors had failed because they came armed with books and lectures. But Grace? Grace carried something deeper, real lessons born from struggle. And in that moment of desperation, Robert made a decision that would change everything. When Robert asked her, Grace was taken aback. She was hired to clean, not to raise his son. She wasn't a teacher. She wasn't a counselor. But Robert saw something in her that even she didn't. An authority that came not from wealth, but from survival. After a long silence, Grace agreed. But she made one thing clear. She wouldn't coddle Ethan. She wouldn't flatter him. She wouldn't bend. She would teach him the way life had taught her, through hardship, through failure, through lessons that left scars but also built character. Ethan didn't know it yet, but his world was about to shift. For the first time in his life, he would face a test that money couldn't buy, charm couldn't pass, and arrogance couldn't escape. Grace wasn't just coming to clean his house, she was coming to clean his soul. And this time, failure would cost him far more than a bad grade. Ethan sat slouched on a leather sofa, phone glowing in his hand, scrolling through photos of parties and cars. Grace entered the room with her usual calm, setting down a basket of freshly folded clothes. She looked at him, then at the mess of soda cans and chip bags littering the table. Her voice was steady. "Pick it up." Ethan didn't even glance up. "Excuse me?" "I said," Grace repeated firmer, "pick it up, all of it. Trash belongs in the bin, not scattered like you live in a pigsty." Ethan smirked, still scrolling. "That's your job, isn't it? To clean up after me?" Grace stepped forward, her shadow falling over him. For the first time, Ethan looked up and saw the steel in her eyes. "My job is to clean this house, not to raise a man who acts like a boy. If you can't respect yourself enough to pick up your own trash, you'll never respect anyone else." The words stung more than he expected. Ethan tried to laugh it off, but something in her tone unsettled him. Nobody ever talked to him like that. The next morning, Grace knocked on Ethan's door at dawn. "Get up," she said. Ethan groaned, burying his head in pillows. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" "Sun's up. So are you." Minutes later, she dragged him, half asleep, grumbling, into the garden where the staff usually worked. For the first time in his life, Ethan held a rake, sweat soaking his shirt under the harsh sun. "Why am I doing this?" he snapped. "Because work humbles you," Grace replied simply. "Because blisters teach you what money can't. And because your daddy may own this estate. But the people who keep it alive look nothing like you." Ethan's face reddened. He wanted to argue, to throw the rake down, but Grace's steady gaze held him. For hours he raked leaves, trimmed hedges, and hauled soil. His soft hands burned, his back ached, and his pride cracked. That night, for the first time, Ethan fell into bed exhausted. Not from partying, but from labor. Later, Ethan went with friends to a country club. He strutted in with his usual arrogance, but Grace's words haunted him. When the black valet greeted him, Ethan's friends made sly jokes. "Hope he doesn't steal your car, Ethan," one snickered. Normally, Ethan would have laughed, but this time something twisted in his gut. He glanced at the valet, tired eyes, a polite smile that hid years of swallowing insults. He saw Grace's face in his mind. Later, when Ethan's friends mocked the waitress for her accent, Ethan didn't join in. He sat in silence, feeling shame crawl across his skin. Grace's lesson was working. Slowly, painfully, it was forcing Ethan to see. One evening, as Ethan sat at the kitchen counter nursing blistered hands, Grace finally told him her truth. "I scrubbed floors for 20 years, she began. "People looked at me the way you look at trash. Some days, they didn't even see me as human. Just a uniform, just hands. My kids ate because I swallowed their hate." Her voice didn't shake. She spoke with calm certainty, each word sinking into Ethan's chest like stones. "And yet, I never stopped working, never stopped fighting, because I wanted my children to stand tall in a world that tried to keep us down." Ethan sat frozen. For the first time, he realized his insults, his racism, his arrogance. It wasn't harmless. It was a wound he was carving into others. And Grace had carried scars just like those her whole life. Robert Wilkerson noticed the changes. Ethan woke up earlier. He ate meals with less entitlement. He even thanked the chef once, clumsily, awkwardly, but sincerely. Robert kept silent, but inside, his heart stirred. Could it be that Grace was succeeding where every elite tutor had failed? But Robert also knew this. Grace's path wouldn't be easy, because breaking privilege was like breaking stone. It would take pressure, fire, and maybe even pain. And the question remained, would Ethan crack, or would he transform? Months later, Ethan's old friends invited him to a lavish birthday party. The mansion buzzed with laughter, music, and expensive champagne. Ethan, dressed sharp, tried to blend in, but something felt off. As the night wore on, his friends began mocking the waitstaff again. This time, they didn't stop at sly comments. They openly belittled the black servers, laughing as if cruelty was sport. "Hey," one sneered, tossing a napkin on the ground. "Pick that up, boy." "Isn't that what you're paid for?" The room erupted in laughter. All eyes turned to Ethan. They expected him to join in. But Grace's voice echoed in his mind. "Respect yourself first, then respect others." Ethan stood frozen, palms sweaty. He felt the weight of every privilege, every cruel word he had ever spoken. Finally, he stepped forward. "That's enough," he said firmly. His friends blinked, startled. Ethan's voice rose louder. "Y'all think this is funny? Humiliating people who are working harder than you'll ever work in your life? I used to be just like you, and I was wrong." The room fell into stunned silence. For the first time, Ethan wasn't the spoiled heir laughing at others' expense. He was standing up against it. His friends didn't take it well. "You've changed, Ethan," one hissed. "Don't forget who you are. You're one of us." Ethan shook his head. "No, I'm not. Not anymore." The fallout was brutal. Overnight, Ethan lost his social circle. The kids who once praised him now called him a traitor. Rumors spread through the elite circles, mocking him as the billionaire's son who went soft. But strangely, Ethan felt lighter. For the first time, he wasn't hiding behind arrogance. He was standing for something real. When Ethan returned home, he found Grace in the garden, pruning roses with worn gloves. He told her what happened, how he spoke up, how his friends abandoned him. For a moment, he worried she might laugh at him. Instead, Grace's eyes softened. She set the shears down, wiping dirt from her hands. "You passed," she said simply. Ethan frowned. "Past what?" "The test life gives every man with privilege, whether he'll use it to crush others or to lift them." Her words hit harder than any lecture. Ethan realized she wasn't just teaching him chores or discipline. She was teaching him humanity. That evening, Robert Wilkerson called Ethan into his study. The room smelled of old leather and cigars, bookshelves lined with generations of wealth. "I've been watching you," Robert said, his voice low. "You've failed every tutor, every teacher, every test I set before you. But Grace," he smiled faintly, "Grace has done what money never could. She's made you a man." Ethan's throat tightened. For years, he had lived chasing his father's approval. And now, finally, he heard the words he had longed for. Robert continued, his tone serious. "One day, all of this will be yours. But understand, wealth without wisdom destroys. And you have Grace to thank for the wisdom you carry now." Ethan nodded, his chest heavy with emotion. Weeks later, Grace packed her modest suitcase. Her work at the estate was finished. Ethan tried to stop her. "You can't leave," he said. "I still need you." Grace smiled gently. "No, son, you don't. You needed me to wake you up. And now that you're awake, it's your turn to keep walking." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes. He wanted to argue, to beg her to stay, but he knew she was right. As she walked out the door, Ethan realized something. Grace wasn't just a maid. She was the greatest teacher he'd ever had. Months later, Ethan sat beside his father at a charity gala. The event raised millions for scholarships, supporting underprivileged youth, an initiative Grace had quietly started. When Ethan read the program, his jaw dropped. The foundation bore Grace's name. She had taken her wages, her savings, and Robert's support, and built something lasting. Ethan stood at the podium, speaking for the first time in front of hundreds. "My greatest teacher wasn't a professor or a mentor from some Ivy League school. My teacher was Grace Johnson, the maid this world looked down on. She taught me dignity, respect, and the kind of strength money can't buy." The crowd erupted in applause. Robert's eyes gleamed with pride. And in the back of the room, Grace stood quietly, her worn hands folded, smiling through tears. The billionaire's son had failed every test: academics, discipline, character. But in the end, it wasn't wealth or privilege that saved him. It was the lessons of a black maid who refused to let him drown in arrogance. Because sometimes the most powerful teachers don't come from gilded halls. They come from lives of struggle, resilience, and scars that carry truth. Ethan never forgot Grace. And every choice he made from then on carried her voice, her strength, her legacy. The boy who once mocked became a man who uplifted. And that was the lesson money could never buy.